Hi friends, it's Kayla. Naturally, it's the week of Halloween, so everybody's making thriller and mystery and horror book lists, and I want to participate. However, I find it incredibly intimidating making recommendation lists because the pressure to tell you that you're gonna like a book, it's a lot. So what I decided to do is just to make a list of all of my favorite horror books. And if you've been here for a long time, you've heard of all of these. But maybe this can act as a resource for anybody who's just trying to find out my all-time favorite horror books. And I'll talk about elements that I consistently pick up and enjoy. I grabbed, I think, 35 books off of my shelves that, even if they were a 4-star, they're just things that stick in my mind, memorable books, stories that had a big impact on me. So I'm going to run through some of my favorite things that I look for. And then when I talk about each book, I might have a little coin next to it representing these things, just so I don't talk about them over and over again. The first thing is books about media. That runs across like all genres for me. I love books that critique media, that reference other media, books within books, mixed media, that type of thing. I also seem to really love horror books, especially with an 80s or 90s setting. I definitely love horror books that have some sort of extra layer of like social commentary or just talking about things that aren't just the, hey, here's a scary thing, look at this scary thing. In that vein, I also tend to like satirical, fun, silly horror. Horror that essentially has some sort of self-awareness. I also love a survival story just in general, and then also an apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, dystopian, futuristic setting. I also really enjoy ambiguity. Cosmic horror often works for me because there's this sense of unknowing or unknowable and unexplained elements, especially to the ending. So if it has this little ambiguous token or coin, know that the ending is probably not going to be deemed satisfying by many people. And the last one is books that other people look at and say, that's not horror, which I feel like does really sum up a lot of my preferences. So there is going to be a lot of hyphenated horror on this list. Literary horror, social horror, a lot of fantasy horror, that type of thing. I was trying to figure out if I should organize this by genre, but what I decided to do was organize this by the size of setting or like how contained the horror is. So we're gonna go from like huge society horror, like the whole world perhaps is involved in the horrific stuff, to maybe there's a house and that is the setting of the horrific stuff, all the way down to psychological, like horror within the mind. So that's the range that we're gonna travel throughout this video. So starting with some large scope, all-encompassing kind of horror, we have Tender as the Flesh by Agustina Bastarrica, which is about this man. He works in a factory which slaughters people for human consumption. Animals have been deemed not safe to eat, so they're all engaging in cannibalism. So of course this has like the societal commentary I was talking about and the kind of futuristic setting, but also something that I like is, what I find most unsettling as a reader is when the characters themselves aren't recognizing what's unsettling. So there are kind of mundane activities to these characters going on, but to me as a reader, I'm like, how? This is not, what? And I think that brings up kind of two ways that I categorize horror personally. There's horror that is meant to be scary to the reader, where there are terrible things happening within the book and you are supposed to be unsettled. And then I find that a lot of the horror that I prefer is unsettling to the characters. So I'm not scared. I don't find myself being scared by horror books like ever. So I understand that's the intent of horror, but I think there's a certain like recognition you can have that this is horrifying to the characters. I'm not unsettled, but I can recognize that that is how they're feeling in this moment. Kind of the difference between, let's say, like Scream horror, which to the characters is absolutely horrifying, but you're not scared as the watcher, versus something like Midsummer, which, yeah, there are some characters who are frightened by what's happening, but generally the unsettling feelings are felt by you as the viewer. This one is most definitely the former, where just the dehumanization of people is very unsettling and all of the gore involved very uncomfortable. As we transition from a pretty popular horror to a pretty unpopular horror, I should recognize that my horror tastes tend to lean unpopular, and also I can't explain them a lot of the time, like why they worked for me. So that brings us to The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, which is a kind of apocalyptic story. It is intimate in the idea that it's taking place in this cabin in the woods with just this married couple and their daughter. But then these people come knock on their door and saying that the world is ending. So big societal impact there. And they need to be let into the house. Obviously, home invasion in general is going to be horrifying for these characters. And the way these two men interpret what's happening to them and handle it differently, and their daughter when you just really get to know the characters. But it is extremely low plot, high ambiguity. It's slow, there's just a lot of arguing, and it's a big story about fear that I just really appreciated. Next up, a fantasy horror, I think we'd call it, Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. This is about the Ku Klux Klan being embodied by like literal demons and a bunch of black monster hunters who are taking them down. It packs a lot in this short novella. Extremely different from the last pick. This is high plot, low ambiguity. It has a lot to say. It says it very clearly. It's got a lot of commentary, obviously, on systemic racism and slavery, but then it's also just like body horror, lots of gore, and the combination of all those elements with the historical context and the revenge story, it just makes for a very interesting read. Next up, we've got Reprieve by James Hahn Matson, and this one is hard to categorize like throughout the chart that I'm creating here because it is an intimate kind of setting. There's an escape room, there's a limited cast of characters, but the majority of it is social horror, and it's talking about society in general. So with social horror, we're often tackling themes of like capitalism, racism, sexuality, gender-based discrimination, the horrors that plague modern day society. With something like The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, we have a vampire story with a lot of underlying themes. This one didn't quite make my list, but we have like sexism and toxic masculinity and racism discussed, but that's not the main plot. Meanwhile, with a book like Reprieve, these social horrors are the focus. And sure, there is some scary and suspenseful moments happening in this escape room. Basically, this group of people are working together and somebody gets murdered. But the bulk of the story is leading up to this moment, how all of these characters got to be here, the discrimination many of them have faced in different aspects of life, things that they've had to overcome, and just their lives before this event happened. This one is like the perfect embodiment of getting the coin of people saying this isn't horror because it wasn't marketed in the right way. But I don't think you can deny that there are many horrific things happening to these characters throughout the book. Gradually getting into some smaller communities, let's talk about The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. This is another fantasy horror, maybe like a fairy tale horror or folk horror. In this, we have a puritanical society and these dark woods that nobody's allowed to enter. Essentially, there were some witches, 4 witches back in the day, who were murdered and their spirits still live in these woods. Of course, our main character goes into the woods and discovers things about her community, about the church, about her family, and the real darkness that exists within the society itself beyond just the witchy magic. I really love the main character in here. I adored the writing. It set itself up well for a sequel, but I don't know if we're ever going to get one, but it does resolve itself enough by the end. There's a lot of feminist rage at the forefront, and I just thought it was a good time with an equal amount of like eeriness and creepiness and magic. Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford is another fantasy folk horror. It's a pretty short book with a really interesting premise. We have this character and her father who have a sort of magic, and people come to them and they open up their bodies and help what's going on inside. In some cases, they have to bury different bodies, and they just use all of this nature-based magic to heal people. The society as a whole, you know, needs them and wants their help, but also fears them. And the story kicks off when our main character meets a boy and has to make a lot of decisions for her life and what she wants to do. What direction is she going? What's her real purpose and what she truly wants? This is definitely a more unsettling to the reader than to the characters type of book. It's strange, it's uncomfortable, and I think it's great. Another community-based one is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgishig Rice, which follows an Anishinaabe community, and it's apocalyptic. The power suddenly goes out, they find themselves really isolated from everyone else, and suddenly they are infiltrated by a group of outsiders seeking shelter. And it's a pretty slow read for how short it is. There's a lot of different characters in this book. You're following a lot of feelings and emotions explored, and there's definitely a good amount of historical subtext. They have to make a lot of decisions about food and safety and who to let in, and it's definitely unsettling. There's a sense of dread as it's the middle of winter, and it's about survival, but surviving the elements as well as each other. The only YA on my list of favorite horror is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This is a story that exists on an island where there is an all-girls boarding school, and a tox has taken over. It's affected the wildlife, it's started to affect the people. There's random growths and strange, disgusting body things happening to the girls. But there's also elements of love and friendship. We're following a couple different POVs, and there are some really messy relationships in here that are fun to follow. There's also a mystery of, you know, how the tox got there, who's bringing them supplies, how and when will they ever get off the island, and where the characters who have seemingly gone missing have really gone. Most definitely ambiguous and a little unsatisfactory for many. I just had a really good time. Action-packed queer girls. It was a win. If you've read Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valenti, you know why I struggled with where to place this in the ranking, but I'm gonna put it here because mostly it is about a neighborhood full of people, and it's definitely, for the most part, an intimate story of a husband and wife. So we're in this neighborhood and we're following a woman who is perfectly happy with her husband. They're totally in love. She loves her neighborhood. She loves her neighbors. Everything is perfect. Nothing can ever go wrong. And it's definitely the case that the reader sees that something is wrong before the character does. So it is unsettling to us, but we don't really know why. I would also put this in the other people don't call this horror category, but I think for such a short novella, it's just incredibly unsettling, especially when she starts to question the rules and why she's not allowed to go in her own basement. Next up, we've got When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen, which is a paranormal horror about the ghosts of enslaved people on this plantation. We're following this one main character who was in this trio of friends when they were children. They went to this plantation and something horrible happened to them. And now as adults, the one like white character in their friendship is deciding to have a wedding on the plantation and doesn't understand why that would be bad for both her friends who are Black coming to a plantation in a celebratory fashion, and also bringing them back to the place where something horrible happened to them. A lot of things go down on this wedding weekend. A lot of histories are confronted. There is definitely a kind of slow burn, but to this very action-packed and horror-heavy revenge mission that these ghosts are on. The next community we'll talk about is the one featured in The Last Final Girl by Stephen Graham Jones. This is written as a movie screenplay. It is an ode to the slasher genre. It's set in the suburbs of Texas where a serial killer is on the loose, and we have a cast of characters who is encountering, investigating, and also like fighting each other to be the last final girl and the one in the spotlight. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's fun. It's campy. It's most definitely not for everyone, which is why this is not technically a recommendation, just a list of my favorites. Next community and neighborhood featured is in When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole, which is what I consider a thriller horror. It's got a lot of social commentary, a lot of self-awareness. It's an extremely slow burn, which perfectly embodies the gentrification that it's representing. The slow but intentional development of gentrification and this neighborhood being taken over, and then suddenly everything is different and you don't recognize anything around you, and it's all super fast moving all of a sudden. We're following a main character who is recognizing some changes in her neighborhood, goes on a tour, and the person running the tour and her end up looking more into their neighborhood and discovering certain terrifying conspiracy theories that are going on behind their backs, or rather right in front of their face. Naturally, like, yeah, there is a bigger scope here, but it is still a pretty intimate story of these two characters. They even kind of develop a romance throughout the book, and I thought it was great. Next, community. Let's talk about the wealthy literature community. So this is The Book of the Most Precious Substance by Sarah Gran, which is about a rare book dealer, and there is this rare book that's in the title, and it's a book about sex magic, and it's apparently the most like powerful occult book in existence, but nobody can find it. So our main character goes on this like kind of adventure trip and involves some other people along the way, engaging with this book, finding the book, selling the book. It has a lot of commentary on the wealthy and people in power and how power corrupts. The book itself, depending on whose hands it's in, can definitely create some horrifying events, or can just be used to fulfill someone's every desire. There's a lot of sexual content in here, which makes it unsettling in its own right, but it's also just very funny and ridiculous. I feel like the horrors of this are more conceptual, so don't expect like big horror moments or to feel frightened by this. I mean, depending on your personality, I don't know. It was so good for me. Next, let's talk about the MFA community in Bunny by Mona Awad. I was gonna say this is an all-time favorite horror, but like, aren't they all? That's the point. This is just pretty high up there though. The type of horror in here is like magic, it's conjuring, it's about rituals and creating creatures, let's say. We have a girl who is very uninterested in all of the girls who call each other Bunny in her MFA class, but then she gets sucked into their world. It is a book about like literature, writing, and kind of the power of imagination. It's got a lot of self-aware pretentiousness, and if you view it with a satirical lens, it's very fun, but also equally like gory and uncomfortable. Before we get into houses, let's talk about like lakes, mountains, forests. Another Stephen Graham Jones has made the list. This is The Only Good Indians. It's following 4 Blackfeet men and them being confronted as adults with this like entity that has been stalking them on a mission of revenge, because back in the day they did something bad. There's conversations about like kind of betraying your culture, and they have to come face to face with their mistakes in the most horrifying way. It does not hold back with its gory scenes, with its true slasher energy, but it also has so much interesting conversation. I think you would say this is Stephen Graham Jones' most successful book as far as pace and what he wanted to accomplish with the story. I know so many people have enjoyed this, and there's a big like nature focus as well, and it's a good time. Then we've got The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher, which is kind of a community, but most of it takes place in like this museum. So this woman is moving to back to her small town, and her uncle has this museum of strange things, and there's a portal to another world. So I guess that makes the scope a little bit larger. This is a cozy cosmic horror is what I would call it. It has its eerie and creepy moments, and especially more creepy for the characters themselves and what they're dealing with. She enlists the help of a local guy, and they go to this strange world together. It's definitely on the more fun, ridiculous side than the scary side if you're looking for that type of horror. I've considered making a video where I recommend horror to people who aren't horror readers, who expect a certain something from the horror genre, but then there's like horror like this, where sure, there are like some jump scares, but you're giggling the page after. I think there's just a lot of interesting things to learn, and the atmosphere is fun. There's a lot of great descriptions, and I would recommend this for like fans of fun horror. Set on a Mountain, next we have Near the Bone by Christina Henry, which honestly like doesn't feel like it fits with a lot of my horror tastes. It's very high action, very little subtlety, and a pretty simple story. I think it's a story about fear. We have a woman who is in a house on this mountain, very isolated. She fears her husband. He fears her leaving the house. Other people might be in the forest and they would learn what's really going on behind closed doors. And also he fears this monster that might be in the woods. Eventually she does leave the house and she sees these other people in the woods and they try to help her, and it ends up being this really fast-paced survival story. I think it also shows like what isolation can do to people, but there's not a lot of like substance in here, which I don't know, just works for me, but I want to set people up properly because I know some people have picked this up and it's just not like a lot of other things that I've enjoyed, because you don't get a lot of backstory and reasoning, but there is like this monstrous creature, which makes it without a doubt horror. Next up on the lake, we've got A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malerman. Very short cosmic horror novella where this couple is going on a date and they see a house underwater and they become obsessed with it. So it's this kind of psychological story, very claustrophobic, where they continually dive under and try to explore the house. This is one of the first times I shared a really unpopular opinion, and I feel like since this I've read a lot of other cosmic horror and other people have read a lot of cosmic horror, and so I know that there is a community for this, though when I originally read it, like everyone was saying that was the least satisfying thing I've ever read. I keep saying I want to reread this, and maybe this is the year. So if a week from now I take back my rating, like who knows, anything could happen. I'm sorry, I guess. Next, let's talk about books with a house setting. I guess moving into another cosmic horror would be a good place to start. This is This Thing Between Us by Gus Marino. This has another slow burn. We're following this man who's grieving from the loss of his wife, and his wife's death is gaining a lot of media attention and people are capitalizing on what happened to her. So he goes to the middle of nowhere to escape that, but he's followed by just a general haunting. There is something following him. It's a kind of grief manifestation story, if you ask me. And in this house, it's not that the house itself is haunted in the middle of nowhere, but it's that he is haunted. This one has kind of a unique writing style too. It's written in letters to his wife, so there are memories shared and thoughts and feelings explored, but you never really get her as a character. So I understand why this doesn't work for some people, but it was in my favorites list last year, I think. Then we've got Catherine House, which I know is another like unpopular pick, but this is a school where people who go there have to abandon everything that they've known for 3 years. And once they come out of it, they will be rich and successful and get everything they've ever wanted. This is by Elizabeth Thomas. And I think it has this just very unsettling gothic vibe to it that I think a lot of horror readers can enjoy. I still just don't think it's found its perfect audience yet because it has a pretty low rating, and it is like ambiguous and just strange and unexplained, but that's okay because I'm not trying to convince anyone to read it. It just has a general vagueness. Like it feels blurry. The main character doesn't really know what's going on. She gets sucked into a lot of strange things. There's an element of obsession and discipline, and it was a good time for me. This one of my most recent horror gothic reads is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas, and this is got your classic setup of a woman in a marriage of convenience. He's had a wife before and his wife is haunting the estate. I found this main character to be extremely well written, have a lot of clear motivation and intent, and when she finds that the house is being haunted, she enlists the help of a local priest, and with some magical things they try to dispel the spirit from the house. Good pace, good plot, even a little bit of romance, a good time. The next one is The Good House by Tananarive Due. This is one of the thickest books that I have on this list, and with that it is a slower moving horror. It's not about high action, even though there is a haunted house. The hauntedness is spliced in like gradually, and there's a couple different timelines and situations going on. So we have this one woman whose son died in their house a couple years ago, and now she's finally returning to the house to like figure out what really happened to him, but also to make a lot of decisions about her future. There is plenty of just her making her way in the world, having a career. There's a romantic relationship throughout here, but then also the house is like objectively haunted, and we get a lot of history of the house and something that her grandmother did back in the day and a tragedy that occurred, and now current day she is fighting the spirits of this house. I think her commitment to finding out the truth, and also her just love of her child, and it being a story about motherhood, really worked for me. And when you bring in this idea of this generational curse, it's just a very interesting story. Then we've got House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, which I actually would say people would say this isn't horror, because I think when you tell people that it's this labyrinth of a horror book about a haunted house that's bigger on the inside than the outside, people go in with certain expectations that it's going to be scary, chilling, like a true haunted house story. And I don't feel like that's what it is, though I do still think it fits within horror. This is my favorite thing because it has all the elements that we talked about. It's very mixed media. It's very exhausting to read. And that is what makes it self-aware, because I think it's intentionally a labyrinth to read. There is a strange house, and there is video footage of this house. And then there is somebody doing an investigation of the house. And then on top of that, there's somebody, you know, writing documentation about the investigation and the footage of the house. And then there's somebody reading the documents pertaining to the investigation, pertaining to the video footage of the house. If you've never heard of House of Leaves somehow, or you've never seen it, I'll show you like a couple ideas in here, okay? So there's just a page of music notes. There's a page that you have to read in a mirror and upside down, and the point is the people in the book don't know what's going on in the house, and every time they open a door it leads them somewhere they've never seen before. There's a set of stairs that's seemingly never ending, and you as the reader are getting the same feelings that they're having in the house: exhaustion, confusion, frustration, because you're having to read all of these things that don't seem imperative to the plot itself. And I do think as you're reading it, you'll figure out the best way for you to read it and enjoy it. Not that I think everybody can or will, but yeah, in my top 3 favorite books of all time. Next up, let's talk Carrie. Now, this is a bind up of Carrie and The Shining, and I would include The Shining on this list. However, I decided when choosing the books, I had to have read them within the last 5 years, because otherwise I would have every single Stephen King on this list. And upon rereading things that I haven't read since high school, I found there's a lot of Stephen King that doesn't hold up for me, or if I remember it one way, like maybe it's even better now. So my memory is foggy unless I've read it in the last couple of years. I did reread Carrie, was it earlier this year or last year? And it was totally different than I remembered, because I think this was the first time I ever read a book that was like mixed media and made up of different elements. So Carrie is the story, like everybody knows the story of a girl at prom night, pig blood on her head, and she has telekinesis and things happen on prom night. If you don't know that story and I just spoiled you, I'm sorry. But what this book does is it's told from Carrie's perspective, but it's also equally told from books and articles that people have written after the fact, talking about Carrie and her powers and what happened and what led up to prom night. And what I find so fascinating about it is that none of it is really seen as fact. Like, this is one where I feel like it is kind of ambiguous, and you can kind of interpret things however you want, because people will write their own experience of what happened, but you don't know for fact that that's what happened. And then there are other people writing like research papers telling you facts about that night, but they weren't there. And I just think the structure of it is really fun. There are horrifying experiences she has at home, and there's a lot of bullying that she encounters at school. It's objectively horror because of all those things, beyond just like what she does on prom night. Next, we're gonna have smaller stories, more so like friendship groups, couples, small family units, and that type of stuff. So let's talk about My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This is a possession story. This is about some best friends in the 80s. They go swimming. One of them comes out acting a little bit weird, and her friends decide that she's possessed and they need to help her. It's very campy and fun and self-aware, and it really is a story about friendship and the lengths that you will go to save your friend. I guess let's talk about another possession story that I have, Goddess of Filth by V. Castro, because this is again about a couple of friends. I think initially there are 5 friends who get together to do a seance. After that, one of them is acting weird. A lot of people don't believe her. She goes and gets the help of like an exorcist. He's very questionable. It's also very strongly about friendship and feminism. This girl is questioning everyone who's trying to help her friend, and she feels like she knows what her friend needs and she'll do whatever it takes to get her the help. There's also a lot of conversations about living as a young Mexican woman in America. There's a lot of interesting commentary. I just found it, like, for how short it is, a pretty great exorcism friendship story. Another friendship story that we're just gonna put it up right now, not horror, don't care, it's in here. It's The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. It's a book about books and an author. We have this man who's writing a memoir about his experience as a teenager, and not scary to the reader, but you can recognize how these events are scary to him. They're just weird things happening anytime his friend is around, and he starts to think that she is a supernatural entity. And you're reading it as his memoir, and as his friend has left commentary throughout it, like scratching things out, adding entire pages of her thoughts and her critiques on both his writing and his memory, because she's like, you're reading too much into this, like, I don't know how you remember this conversation going down this way, that never happened, this never happened. But there are a lot of things that he deemed weird and questionable as their friendship developed, and I think it's just a really well done book, even though it doesn't necessarily fit into the genre that people expect it to. Next up, we've got Tinfoil Butterfly by Rachel Eve Moulton, which also was in my favorites of the year. This is a kind of psychological cosmic horror. It's about trauma, it's about facing your past, it's about remembering things, and it's about saving each other. So we have an unlikely duo in a young woman who is running away from this guy she just hitchhiked with, got into his van. The book kicks off with her just like running away from him, and she encounters this little boy wearing a tinfoil mask, and they both kind of have secrets and have dark pasts, and they're on this survival run together, trying to escape whatever evil is after them. It's really just a book full of dread. Like, the entire time I was super uneasy, but I didn't know why. I just felt this dread. And I think by the end it just has some really beautiful things to say, and it's fascinating, all of the conversations that it brings to light. Then I've got Dowry of Blood, A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, which is again written in like letters to someone. It's Dracula. This, I guess you'd call a fantasy horror. It was in the horror category at Goodreads Choice Awards last year, which is why I initially read it. We're following a woman who was saved from the brink of death, and she starts to discover that her husband is not everything she expected him to be. He is bringing other people into their marriage. He is just progressively being an awful person, and there's a really bold and candid conversation about abuse and abusive relationships in here. Again, it's a short one, has a really good message while being horrific. Then we've got Sorrowland by River Solomon, which is another fantasy horror, body horror. I think I've said that word too many times now in this video. It is about this woman going through a kind of metamorphosis. Her body is changing. She has recently escaped a cult. She has her children with her, and she's just trying to exist in the real world, but she is being hunted. There's a lot of relevant themes in here regarding police brutality and suffering medical experimentation. And the word that I think I would use for this is just distressing. The entire time you want the best for her and you want to see good things happen, but there's so much to get through and it's all so horrifying and distressing. But again, it has like really good messages and a really strong intent in here. I just adore River Solomon's writing. Next up, One About a Little Family, Nana by Brandon Massey. This is the story of a family who recently lost their grandmother, adoptive grandmother, and the biological grandmother shows up out of nowhere and becomes a part of the family, kind of a missing piece very quickly, integrates herself into every aspect of this family's life and becomes kind of irreplaceable, though there are a lot of questionable things about this woman that the family doesn't necessarily see. And it feels like there's kind of a veil over them, like she has this weird power over them that they can't recognize, that she is getting more youthful and she has different like sexual exploits throughout the book that are so uncomfortable and wrong. And also the mother in the family is aging and getting ill. It's another kind of slow burn horror, not in that no horror happens for a long time and then suddenly it's horrific. It's more so, it's just small little uneasy things happening the entire time before anybody really recognizes it enough to do something about it. Definitely horrifying for the family, uneasy for the reader, and it's got some good reveals at the end. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield is about a couple. It's one of the most intimate stories and the lowest plot stories. It is literary horror, and we're following a married couple. One of them went on a deep sea mission and came back changed. The other woman wants to support her and love her and try to understand her, but she's very closed off. They're trying to figure out what life looks like now, if they can continue on with the life that they were living before. It's slow, it's sad. You only get a little glimpse into the deep sea mission, but while you're there, it is a very short book in general. It's claustrophobic and there are a lot of things left unanswered, and it's really not scary, but you can see how scary it is for these people to not know what's really going on. It was pretty emotional to read and I was uneasy and felt another like sense of dread the entire time. Then we've got The Family in the Between by Tananarive Due. We're mainly following this man who was saved from drowning as a child and now as an adult feels like death is following him. So there's the horror there, and then there's also real life horrors. His wife is the first Black judge in their area and she's getting a lot of racist hate mail, and the family is just being followed by bad people and then also bad feelings because the man, he doesn't really know what's reality and what's a dream. So he does a lot of things and says a lot of things that seem out of character, and there's just this sense of evil like haunting the family as a whole, but mainly it is his experience. I absolutely love books where characters are losing their sense of reality, whether it's like mental health or an evil entity. So this was an interesting read. Speaking of losing your sense of reality, I've got Come Closer by Sarah Gran, which is very much just in this one woman's head as she is experiencing what she thinks is possession. Sarah Gran's writing is just very like tongue-in-cheek and silly almost. Like there are quizzes this woman is taking throughout the book where she's like, am I possessed by a demon? She has to keep retaking the test, and every time she's filling out more of the bubbles as she's losing her grip on reality more and more. She's basically just, it's pretty short, so she suddenly starts doing things very out of character for her, having outbursts, smoking, and she's suddenly plagued with these intrusive thoughts that she thinks is a demon telling her to commit horrible acts. I think that in itself, and the psychological torment of not knowing if you're losing your mind, is just a terrifying thought. So I had a good time with this one. And then speaking of just being in somebody's mind, I put this here because though it involves a community, I feel like if you read the first like 50 pages and you're not enjoying the main character's voice, it's not suddenly going to turn around because you are so much in Jade's mind throughout the entirety of My Heart is a Chainsaw, the third Stephen Graham Jones on this list. Yes, it takes place in this entire community. There is a lake, very much the focus, a place called Camp Blood, there's a forest, there's lots of people involved, but you are reading the stream of conscious thoughts of Jade, who is obsessed with the slasher genre, constantly talks about horror movies, her love of horror movies, and one day she decides that it's happening in real life. There are murders that people aren't connecting the dots and seeing that there's a serial killer. There's people who can clearly stop the serial killer in her mind, but they're not fulfilling their role properly. Her role is clearly in the slasher, the person who nobody believes. And we spend so much time just in her mind convincing herself that all of these things are happening around her, and she's kind of this unreliable narrator. It is one of the slowest burns, but the action and the horror, though I know some people will say this isn't horror, really takes off at the end, which is just the best payoff from somebody who's like already enjoying being in this mind, hearing about all of my favorite movies. And then I do get the truly horrifying stuff beyond the other horrifying stuff, like the trauma she's experienced and the gentrification happening on this indigenous land. There are indeed horrific deaths that are happening. So it's just such a fun time. Stephen Graham Jones is absolutely the author for me. I have a couple other novellas I was considering listing here, but that is all the books that immediately just popped into my mind that I would say are like all-time favorites, at least of the last 5 years and at this point in my life. So thank you so much for watching. If you've read any of these and loved them, I would love to hear. If you haven't read a single one of these and you never would, and this just isn't your genre at all, I'd love to hear that too. I can't imagine you would watch this whole thing, but if you did, thank you so much, and I will see you later. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.